Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
SciFi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Keith, and today is Wednesday, which means we're talking about Not Hyperion, and also that I do the same intro that I always do. I think I'm going to start scripting intros and rotating through them, because I feel like all of you must be tired of the same intro week after week at this point. I know that I would be, and I feel bad about it. So, we're going to fix that. Probably not. I'm not going to remember next week, if we're being honest. Let's not set the expectations too high, Keith. Sorry, everybody. I wish that I was better at this. Yeah. So it's Wednesday. We're not talking about Hyperion. We are back on Brave New World, which is a book by Aldous Huxley. It's pretty dang good. I went through chapters 2 and 3 today. Last week, we spent an entire hour talking about Chapter 1. So just to give you an idea of how ridiculously dense this book is, I spent an hour talking about Chapter 1 and still did not feel like I covered everything that I wanted to cover in regards to what it is that this book is saying. I will say that I think that this book is heavily front-loaded with philosophy and premises, the premises necessary to set the tone of the story, if you will. Especially since a lot of the character interactions are going to be heavily reliant on the ontology of the individuals that occupy this particular world. So I'm going to kind of go over just a brief synopsis of what happens story-wise in chapters 2 and 3. And then I'll spend the rest of the podcast talking about the philosophy and the ideas that are kind of being thrown around by Huxley. Because the book is written in a very interesting fashion where we get these kind of like whiplash transitions between the inner monologue of a character by the name of something Marx. I can't remember his first name for some odd reason. His first name might be Marx. I can't remember exactly. I'm not sure if it's a reference to Marx, but whatever. Either way, we get him, and then I think the other primary character is going to be a love interest that has been introduced to us. I would guess that it's Fanny or another female character. I'd have to look at the Google page in order to know because I wasn't really paying attention to the names, just the concepts that were kind of being thrown around. So just based off of the first two characters that we've got kind of orbiting each other, we'll go from there accordingly. So as we talked about in Chapter 1, most of that chapter, if not all of it, is spent in this facility where they create human beings, if you will. Basically, it's a giant cloning facility that they reproduce human beings in, and it's pretty intense and kind of really creepy and terrifying at the same time because basically, Huxley is saying or implying that via technology, the understanding of the human mind and psychology, so neuropsychology and psychology in conjunction with each other, that you can essentially indoctrinate individuals in their subconscious long before they ever take their first breath. They even refer to the individual human beings as their like animal forms, if you will, throughout their gestation process. So they call like the beginnings of a human in the womb a fish, and I think a bird, and then maybe a monkey because there's a tail involved. So, which is actually pretty good, pretty apt references as far as the cellular development of a human is concerned. If you look at the development process of a human fetus, there are times where it looks pretty much parallel to a lot of other things in the animal kingdom that are more simple creatures. Kind of hearkening to the idea that everything is made from the same building blocks as far as genetic material is concerned. But we kind of get introduced to some main players here, and it seems like there's some primary concepts at work in the first couple chapters, and I think that primary concept is going to be the idea. Like I said, I'm going into this book completely blind. So if you've read it before, or if you're aware of what goes on in the book, then I do apologize. This is just kind of like, think of this as a fun experiment of somebody who's never heard anything about this book giving their just blind reaction to it and discussing the implications of it, which I think is a very valuable thing to do, hence why I am doing it. So I think that a lot of this book is going to orbit around the idea of monogamy or romance, or basically love for a singular person of the opposite gender. For the specifics of this book, I do feel that the sexuality of the characters could be totally interchangeable. I think the general idea is a monogamous romantic relationship with another individual, and that's kind of like the primary subject as far as like subject matter is concerned. So the primary two players are the individual whose name I believe is Marks, or at least that's who the primary player seems to be currently, who is generally not a well-loved individual. There is an indication in this first chapter that there was something that occurred to him during development that made him turn out not perfect as far as his phenotypic expression is concerned, as in the physical expression of his genetic material did not turn out perfectly because of a developmental thing that happened to him. But as far as his genetics and everything else are concerned, he is pretty much impeccable as far as alphas are concerned. What I think is interesting is that one of the female characters whose point of view we kind of get to experience in the third chapter is talking about the way that she kind of views the men of the upper echelon, if you will. Because it seems like these two individuals are a part of high society. They're not epsilons. They are alphas. Though I am not totally sure whether or not Huxley is including women in the roles. I'm not sure if women just kind of modulate in and out of every area, or if they are kind of isolated to the alpha, gamma, beta, epsilon, all that jazz. I would guess that they are, because there is kind of like this interesting portion in chapter 3 where we're going back and forth between like the indoctrination of a little, what I believe is a little girl, into thinking certain things about certain classes of people, and associating like the colors of clothing and the materials of clothing with that person's inherent class place in the system within the hierarchy that Huxley is laying out for us. So khakis, for instance, are the clothing of the epsilons, and so that means that she should not associate with anybody who wears khakis. She should only associate with people who are in a certain class and above. And I'm not sure if that class is exclusively alpha or anything like that. I think that generally speaking, the individuals of the lower class kind of have their animal drives manipulated out of their regular thought, if that makes sense. So individuals who are of the lower classes, I'm not entirely sure that they engage in primal activities, if that makes sense. And that's also kind of the way that it's phrased in this chapter, as being like a raucous primal activity. So our primary kind of one of the first people that we hear talked about is this woman who's seeing a gentleman named Henry, which might be Henry Marks. I can't remember. Like I said, I'd have to look. Again, I'm terrible with names. I'm bigger on concepts. I'm sure that I will go back and take some more notes so that I can more effectively talk about these two individual characters. But she's talking with one of her friends about how she has only been with him for the last few months, and that's not normal. And so the general perception that we talked about in the last chapter is this idea that everyone belongs to everyone. So there's no such thing as monogamy. There is just a kind of like general copulation of everybody with everybody. There's no risk of STDs. There's no risk of pregnancy. So there is no reason for people to not satisfy that itch, as it were. And so people will just frequently, be bouncing around from not from partner to partner, even just from person to person. They wouldn't even call them partners. It's just kind of like this itch that gets scratched. There's even mention of the fact that women will undergo synthetic pregnancy substitutes. And so basically their body will be told in some capacity that it went through a pregnancy in order to sate some sort of subconscious desire that still exists within the female genetic code that they have yet to, remove from that particular experience. And I think that it's interesting that Huxley makes a specific mention of this idea that, a woman would experience the need to have a child. I obviously know that there are numerous exceptions to this generalization. I just think that it is an interesting observation on his part to make a statement like that. Not necessarily implying that that is an intrinsic aspect of womanhood, but it is interesting that Huxley himself viewed it as being an intrinsic aspect of womanhood. So I can't speak, of course, since I'm not a woman, as to whether or not generally his statement on the idea that that is an intrinsic desire of someone who is female, I can't speak to whether that's true or not. Again, I just think that it's interesting that he mentions it as being such an important part of the human experience for women that they would have to create synthetic pregnancies in order to for women to feel psychologically complete in some capacity as adults. So I'm not sure if that's just a reflection of Huxley's times or if it is a somewhat accurate statement. You can definitely let me know in the comments. I try not to make any claims as far as the experience of individuals who exist in a different world than I do. Just like to point out things that I find interesting in the text, and I felt that that was a very interesting thought from Huxley. So after we get this original woman who has talked about how she's only been with Henry and her friend is encouraging her to seek out other individuals to be with, we get the perspective of another woman who is entering into a room and has been with every man in that room. And by been with, I am referring to specifically had intercourse with in some capacity. And she is, oddly enough, talking about the subtle differences between all of these individuals, which I found to be interesting because it seems to me that based off of the processes involved in or that were being explained in the tour of the facilities, that ideally all individuals would be like barely apart from each other as far as degrees of variation are concerned. So the fact that she's able to say that like one man is too hairy, one man is short, one man is tall, etc., I think speaks to this idea that there is something intrinsic about the reproductive process that cannot be removed and still maintain a legitimate lineage of humanity. But the overall theme throughout most of this facility, to me, seems to be the idea of the removal of humanity in some regard. So it's more that, or it seems to me that all of this intelligence, all of this advanced technology in some regard is ultimately differentiating man from the rest of the world, but at the same time, the individuals in Brave New World who are participating in these processes are actively trying to dehumanize the process in a very specific way so as to remove the specialness of the individual and emphasize that human as an animal just needs to exist in an efficient and meaningful way in the world. And so the meaning of life doesn't come from the ability to find meaning within oneself, but comes from the ability to contribute to the whole of society. And that is why everyone belongs to everyone, why your role is decided for you at birth it being in quotes, and also why the people no longer reproduce via intercourse. I think the word they use specifically is vivipariously or something like that. Not entirely sure. So we're going to keep talking about this type of stuff right after this quick commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
About the ideas kind of being presented in A Brave New World, specifically in regards to the mentality behind human reproduction, as well as monogamy and romance, which I think all three are going to play a pretty heavy role in this particular book. So, in Chapter 3, there's a specific interaction between the director, who's been giving this tour of the facility the entire time, and a few teenage boys, who I believe are in the Alpha Intellectual Education Center. Not totally sure. Now, as I've mentioned before, this first chapter kind of jumps in between the perspectives of individuals who are going to be kind of probably primary players throughout the story, and just like the kind of general happenings of the facility. I believe that is so we can get an understanding of how the individual, how the lead role or the important players perceive the world around them, but in addition, an ontology and a thorough understanding of the way that the world operates in this particular book, which I think is really important because, again, if Huxley doesn't spend all this time setting the stage, then when we go through these interactions later on in the book, then we're not going to necessarily have the same point of reference that we ought to in regards to why these actions are important or different or rebellious in some capacity, because they'll be perceived as very normal for us. And when Huxley is writing this book, he's already writing it in a way to where he's kind of looking to the future in some regard, and the way that people might act prior to the world being unified underneath the ideas of this like kind of Fordian religious type thing that they've got going on. As I mentioned last episode, they kind of worship the conveyor belt. Gosh darn it. Why? Yeah, I guess conveyor belt. I don't know. They worship the idea of like the manufacturing system as being the ideal version of humanity in some capacity. So if you can imitate the industrial manufacturing of a Model T in society through, or as the way that individuals are brought up and designed, if you will, then you've reached some sort of level of like utilitarian perfection, which is generally what I think the society in this book is kind of trying to show us, how we might get to a point where we could perceive things as being perfect in a utilitarian fashion. That meaning that there is the least amount of suffering for the greatest amount of good, and that balance has been struck in a way that is profoundly meaningful. So in this specific interaction that the director has with these alphas who are being educated to become intellectual, or alphas in the intellectual branch, I don't know exactly what that implies for them, but that's what they're called. He's asking them about the idea or the way in which individuals were brought into the world prior to the onset of like the world state or the city state. So the overall government that rules the world and kind of controls these production facilities for human beings, these human being production facilities. And the boys specifically have this particular moment where they feel uncomfortable by the idea of human reproduction, but not by the idea of intercourse between two individuals. They think of human reproduction as a result of intercourse as being something lewd and undesirable. What's interesting and funny is that, like Superman on Krypton, this is kind of similar to the society that they have, or had rather. All of the, I don't know if it's comic book canon, someone correct me if I'm wrong, please, but I believe that what makes Superman so special is that he is born of a natural birth rather than being like a test tube baby, if you will. So that's part of what makes him exceptional, in addition to the fact that he gets sent to Earth, or his parents loved him far more because whatever reasons. Regardless, I think it's interesting that that particular trope, the idea of human beings no longer being created through the means of natural reproduction but being created in a lab or in a manufacturing facility, the fact that that is a trope amongst the idea of dystopian or even utopian novels, to me has specific implications that I'm not entirely sure if there's like a kind of like a dispute here between the ideas of religion, where part of the suffering brought on by original sin is the process of labor, or if this is just kind of the idea that if you remove reproduction from individuals and put it into the hands of like a larger conglomerate, that individuals stop viewing their children as being as special as they normally would, and therefore those children will not view other human beings as being as special as they normally would, et cetera, right on down the line. But these teenage boys specifically have an issue with trying to talk about this. And the director, of course, is very casual about it and says, like, this, can you believe this? Individuals used to have, individual women used to carry a child for 9 months and then they would birth it naturally, quote unquote. Like, this seems disgusting and foul, does it not? And I think that this particular instance of indoctrination further affirms the idea that natural human processes are not a part of the overall scheme of efficiency, which therefore further dehumanizes specific acts. So the act of intercourse, it's to specifically kind of talk about this in a PG way, the act of intercourse is not only intentioned ontologically for like a hedonistic thing, it is also intentioned or intended to potentially perpetuate the existence of a species. And I think that, if you were to ask Huxley, he would advocate, and in my opinion I would agree, that the idea of the perpetuation of the species is part of what drives individuals subconsciously to desire the intimacy of, specific acts between themselves and other individuals. And because of this, or because this is removed in the experience of these individuals, I think what we're going to find is that ultimately there is some sort of dissatisfaction or malaise associated with those acts, especially kind of like a rut, if you will, associated with those acts, because there's no longer purpose to them other than for self-fulfillment. But that's kind of paradoxical in this world, because the self doesn't really exist in this world. The self exists in conjunction with its purpose within the grand scheme. So the idea of self-satisfaction doesn't come from self. It comes from the satisfaction of one's role within the world. And so the ability to just kind of wantonly select partners to be intimate with is another way by which this society kind of discourages the idea of individuality. And I think that what Huxley is trying to say through this particular example is that part of what creates an individual is the interaction and the intimacies that that individual has with their potential partners. And I think that it's important to talk about this, just not necessarily from a moral or ethical standpoint, but just from a standpoint of interesting observation. Because if part of Huxley's, equation, if you will, to result in a utopian society where the individual is no longer valued, part of that equation is the idea of turning intimate acts into casual acts. And I think that the easiest example for him is to turn to intercourse, because it's kind of the one that's most relatable by pretty much anybody who's going to be reading his book. But I would guess that as we go out throughout this book, we're going to find that there's just generally a lack of intimacy overall in every interaction that every individual has with each other. Because I think that intimacy is an intrinsic part of the creation of an individual. So if you kind of like take some pithy platitudes and say, oh, who I interact with is who I'm going to imitate. Well, the majority of human behavior is based off of imitation and not off of a synthesizing of ideas. It's not as if, someone comes up with a tool and there was no tool that existed before it. There was a tool that existed before that in its more simple form, and more simple than that, and in its more simple form, etc., right on down the line until you end up with human beings watching, or the human ape before it becomes a human, right, watching another animal use a particular aspect of its anatomy to perform a task, and then an unevolved human imitating that anatomy in the form of through using another object in the world. So, an anteater has a long tongue and a long snout. I don't know if anteaters occur outside of South America. I would guess that they do. I don't think they're a unique to South America type thing. But like the termite mounds in Africa where chimpanzees will go and stick a stick down there, like there is some sort of conclusion that was drawn by a chimpanzee at some point that the anatomy, this is my guess, my opinion, is that in the evolutionary chain, at some point in that chain, there was a conclusion drawn by a chimpanzee that some part of the anatomy of another creature was what allowed them to complete this task. And they were able to add those two factors together to come up with a solution to accomplish a task that they wanted to accomplish. In this same way, human behavior is created. But it's not created, again, it's imitated. So if you're looking at intimacy between two individuals, there's a lot of imitation that occurs back and forth between those two individuals. You'll frequently hear people say you are who you hang out with, and you are your parents, or your parents will... My parents have frequently said you raise your grandparents. So, my kids will be like my parents rather than like me. But ultimately, that's just because I am too close to the forest to see the trees and what I act like, but I can certainly see what it is or how it is that my parents act. So my perception would be that my child acts more like my parent, even though they probably act a lot like me, and I just view them as my parent because I'm not willing to admit that I act like my parent. And that is just part of the way that human behavior works. So if you remove the intimacy of human relationships and you represent that hyperbolically through intercourse specifically, then what you're going to end up with is a bunch of people who are only imitating what it is that they are told to imitate and acting in a way that they are told to act. It's the perfect form of indoctrination. Friendships become unimportant because the way in which you're going to interact with the world has already been determined. So there is a united mentality or a united psychology surrounding the idea of human interaction with the world and with other individuals. And that is part of what is so sinister about this particular society. And this is not a unique element to Huxley's dystopian novel. It's in most dystopian novels that individual intimate relationships are discouraged. But the fact that Huxley is incorporating this in the form of showing us like a more casual, hedonistic lifestyle as being the one that is lauded above others, or lauded above others, is to kind of show us in a hyperbolic way, like, look how valuable intimacy is in your everyday life. And if it's as valuable as it is in something as grand as, a physical intimacy with another individual, then think about how important it is all the way down the line to the intimacy that you have with your parents as a child prior to your ability to perceive yourself as an individual. I think that there's just a lot that goes into this as far as depth of thought is concerned and the importance of intimacy in relationships that Huxley is kind of subtly telling us by saying, like, look what it is, how it is you can develop an individuality that's meaningful. It includes relations with other human beings that are meaningful. And in that relationship, we're able to create more meaning and perpetuate cycles of self-growth, self-development. So we're going to kind of move on to some other aspects of the story, but that'll be right after this next quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
The ideas of the importance of intimacy and how that plays a role in the development of an individual within society and the idea of individuality. We're going to be kind of moving into a different area of philosophy that I found to be important, or at least intriguing in some regard, in A Brave New World, which is the book that we're talking about by Aldous Huxley. So there is kind of like this predictive element to this book that I found to be very, very interesting, that I think is profoundly accurate in some scary ways, I guess would be the best way to phrase it. The director of this facility, in his discussion, again, with the alpha intellectuals, is talking about the ways in which people formed bonds, and in addition to that, the way by which the world was united. So, just in talking about the ideas behind the form of bonds. So, as I've mentioned before in the podcast, both this episode and last episode, one of the primary mottos, if you will, of the state is this idea that everyone belongs to everyone. So there is no exclusivity in relationships. There is no exclusivity in your work. There's no individuality in any aspect of society in this world, because individuality is what causes friction between individuals and creates alternative motives, creates alternative perceptions of reality and of being. In an odd way, Huxley's portrayal of the future is kind of, I guess, supportive of certain ideas within philosophies of people like Leibniz, the idea of monadism. Basically, just in kind of like a very abridged version, the conclusion drawn in that particular philosophical set of beliefs is that reality is shaped by perception, and that that perception shapes reality. So the reality that exists within individuals is the one that actually exists. So if there are three blind men touching an elephant, not only are they all experiencing what is something that is real, but they, in their collective experience, are creating the elephant. The elephant does not exist on its own outside of the perception of the individuals. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, it does not make a sound. Because objectively, sound is an interpretation of the agitated vibrations of an object interacting with another form of object or mass in a way that involves force in some regard to create the vibrations. So, sound is only a reality that is created by the perception of sound. It does not exist objectively. And this is a philosophic idea set that I personally believe to be very sound as far as the way in which the world is kind of experienced. I would say that reality or perception does shape reality in regards to the fact that, things are all kind of relative to people's experience of them. But in addition to that, in a more profound way, truth is ultimately kind of unknowable, in my opinion. And so the truth of the reality that we experience is the one that ought to be most important or most paramount to us as individuals. And that is part of why our perception is the thing that shapes reality, because what becomes important to us is the thing that is given meaning. It is the thing that is given value in the hierarchy of existence. And the reason that I'm bringing this all up is that if a society could exist where every single person's consciousness was in alignment with a singular perception of reality, in some regard that might be viewed as a utopia, because reality is now uniform. Reality now has some sort of objective existence. It's not chaotic. It is orderly, in the same way that a manufacturing facility is orderly. Everything has a purpose, every cog turns in a specific way, and it is designed to do that. And I think that in some regard this is potentially commentary of Aldous Huxley on the ideas of certain religious beliefs. Again, I don't know how aware of Nietzsche Huxley was, but one of Nietzsche's main things or main gripes with religion, as I've mentioned before, is the idea that because an afterlife exists, the life that we live currently holds no importance, and therefore, if you believe in an afterlife, you're essentially a quasi-nihilist, if not a complete nihilist. And being a nihilist is totally useless, because what is the point of believing in nothing while still suffering? And that's kind of Nietzsche's, very much in a 10 seconds or less, kind of Nietzsche in a jar, if you were going to try to describe his overall view of the world. And I think that Huxley is kind of indicating a similar thing, where he's basically implying that if we all existed within this, like, singular perception of reality, if we all simply were these cogs on these machines and there was no individuality, then where is it that we gain purpose or meaning from? Another one of Huxley's books that is similar in tone and genre to A Brave New World is Play Your Piano, which is another, I guess dystopian novel would be the best way to describe it, where the idea of monogamy and religiosity isn't what's being challenged, but the idea of purpose and work is being challenged. So Play Your Piano posits a society in which everything has become so automated that people no longer have to work for anything. They have no reason to work because everything is automated. So it kind of goes through the ennui or the malaise of an individual who exists in that world, in the same way that we're kind of going through like the anger and the desires of an individual who's in a world where individuality has been squashed in favor of a more communal approach to life in general. So I find that to be particularly fascinating. I really think that it's interesting that Huxley is able to kind of write these effective and well-written books about two different aspects of what kind of makes up society and comment on them in ways that force us as readers to reflect and think, what is it exactly that is so important about this particular idea? And what I think would be important to Huxley in Brave New World is that the construction of a collective reality, rather than a singular reality, is a more true reflection of something that can be valued and of something that can be analyzed and thought about. If things exist objectively, then rather than pursuing meaning is just given to us and we do not value it. But if the system has no basis no basis within a singularity, then there's no reason, or then there's more reason for us to have to work from the bottom up. But if it's just handed to us, then we don't have to start work from the bottom. We start work from a presuppositional idea that everything has a specific amount of value. And that's kind of the way that humans are being made in these factories, is that every individual has a specific amount of value in regards to their overall impact of society within the world state. So the epsilons are equal in value to the alphas, even though they're viewed as being dirty or lesser than or what have you. And the same with the betas and all that. They're all equal, ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, truly equal, because they all are predestined to have a certain amount of impact, and if they have had that amount of impact on the society around them, then they have done well, good, and faithful servant. So the state has become God in some regard because overall, or society has become God in some regard because overall, the purpose is no longer to satisfy the idea of the individual, but to satisfy the role the state has given you, which is why they condition people. There's a specific mention of people who work on rocket ships. They condition them to experience joy when upside down by starving their brains of blood during gestation, starving their brains of blood for a specific amount of time, and then like bringing them back to another position in order to give the brain blood again, but that position is all related to the positions that they will naturally experience when they are working on a rocket ship. And so because of this hardcore conditioning that basically creates individuals who are exclusively destined for one particular role, one particular perception of reality, one particular type of existence, and that being the most value that they can provide, there is no reason for them to strive for anything beyond that. There's no reason to think. There's no reason to interact with the world in a meaningful way because things are kind of just handed to you as being objectively valuable. And that's kind of what I think Huxley is kind of implying through the particular ways in which human beings are being manipulated at this facility. And I think that, again, that's hearkening back to the ideas of Nietzsche by saying that if meaning is handed to us by a god or by the state or by a manufacturing process based off of specific efficiencies, then ultimately what you get is this homogeneous, unexciting, self-serving, hedonistic world where individuals pursue all of these meaningless pursuits because they're supposed to. Because individual desire no longer exists. It's been removed from the equation by the singularity or the singular perception of an objective reality created by a collective consciousness that has been instilled by the state. And I think that it is so deeply ingrained in this culture that even the individuals who are perpetuating it don't even see it as being that way. They see it as a necessity or even as an intrinsic aspect of human life. And that, I think, is supported by the fact that those boys were unable to discuss the ideas of natural human reproduction without feeling uncomfortable by it. The idea that individuals would engage in a particular act of intimacy in order to perpetuate the human race is so foul and disgusting that they can't even view it as scientific anymore. They view it as lewd or as crass. But the fact of the matter is that, ultimately we know it's not. But this is just kind of Huxley's way of being expository about the setting. If we are to understand the actions of the individuals in this novel as the novel progresses, then there's no way for us, then we have to understand every small intrinsicity of the world in which they live. And that includes the subtle cultural norms that are a part of that world. And without all of this exposition on Huxley's part, we're just not going to have a point of reference because it's so vastly different from what we experience now, especially for us as Americans. The idea of the individual is touted as being the greatest of goods. It is, I won't say it's impossible, but it's unreasonable to expect anything else as far as the perception of the world is concerned. There is nothing greater than the individual rights and liberties of people within the United States, according to their own perception. We all are kings, queens, non-binary rulers, whatever you want to identify as, of our own little galaxies. We are the creators of our own reality. And that is somewhat ontologically true, in my opinion. But whether or not that's practical is a completely different discussion outside of whether or not it is if it is the way that the world actually is. And so I think that Huxley is doing a great job in this book of setting us up, especially as individuals from a different culture and a different time, to understand why it is that certain things in this world exist in the way that they exist, and why it is that they're so taboo, and things of that nature. So we're going to take one more commercial break, and then when we come back, we're going to kind of talk about the ideas of ownership and the ideas of interactions that Huxley is kind of positing within the last bit of this chapter, as well as some of the restrictions that are placed on individuals, which are typical of dystopian novels, and other tropes that I see in common between this novel and other dystopian novels. So we've got a lot to try to cram into the last 15 minutes of this show. So wish me luck, and we will be right back.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Break. I am excited to kind of conclude our discussion for today on Brave New World, which is rapidly becoming one of my favorite dystopian novels. I'm generally a Fahrenheit 451 guy. I think that Ray Bradbury's prose in that particular novel are impeccable. But as far as prose, the world, and style is concerned, Huxley is growing on me pretty quickly. I am definitely a fan, to say the least. So, right before the break, we were kind of talking about the ideas within the overall society as a whole, specifically in reference to like Nietzsche and monadism, and kind of how it is that Brave New World may accidentally or intentionally reflect the idea of monadism in monadism's proposals about the way in which reality is formed around us. So, just some things to consider as we kind of venture further into the novel. But something that I kind of wanted specifically to mention is another interaction that the director has with the alpha intellectuals as he's kind of finishing up his tour before we start getting introduced to the primary players in the novel who I mentioned earlier. And what happens basically is that he starts talking about the ways in which relationships were practiced during like our time, so contemporary times, and how those are viewed in reference to the ways in which relationships are practiced during their time. And what he says is that every relationship that individuals had was based off of an idea of ownership of the relationship, as well as ownership of another individual. So monogamy, the idea of marriage. The director is proposing that marriage is intrinsically tied to the ownership of another person. So exclusivity, in any regard, even willingly chosen, represents a form of ownership. It represents a function of power and violence, in their opinion. So, someone who chooses to be married to one individual, those individuals are committing a forceful or manipulative act upon the other individual in order to convince that person to be loyal to or singular in their desire for that other person. And as I've mentioned before, the idea of intimacy is something that I think has kind of been squashed out of this world. So for them to look at a marital relationship or a singular relationship between two individuals, they're not going to view it as an agreement or as a contractual obligation. But the reason that I'm even bringing this up is because I'm kind of curious about Huxley's views on the idea of marriage and monogamy. Because to me it seems that he's not particularly glorifying the utopia or the dystopian society that it is that we're experiencing. But at this particular juncture, he's not making it sound terrible either. It's very objective in his portrayal of this world. And I believe that that's intentional. I think what Huxley is trying to do is get us to reflect on whether or not it is that marriage does have an intrinsic function of power and violence within it. And now I'm not talking about violence as in, someone is attacking somebody else. I'm talking about violence in a metaphoric or ontological sense. And the idea that someone is exerting a force, be it consciously, subconsciously, physically, or intangibly, is creating a force to influence another individual's decisions. And now to use the word violent might seem a little bit hyperbolic, but I personally am an advocate for this type of view on it because I think that, in my opinion, it gives us a more humble approach to the way that we interact with other individuals, and an approach of humility is always going to be, in my opinion, the most advantageous approach to start out with when it comes to discussing particular topics. So in this particular instance, it is viewed as an act of, or it is, I think Huxley is trying to get us to think about whether or not marriage ought to be viewed as an act of, violence or force. And I would say, in my opinion, that I don't think that that is the case. I believe that two individuals can come together to make a decision to be singular in their desires and as a team, whether that includes exclusivity physically or exclusivity emotionally. That's up to each individual set of partners. But I think that individuals can come together and form a small community of their own in the form of a partnership. But the thing that comes from that is a unique worldview that is specific to the partnership that is formed. I think an ideal marriage is formed by two people who are teammates, not necessarily one relying upon the other, but they're actively combining their forces to better play a game, that being the game of life in some regard. Because ultimately, it's really hard for individuals to succeed on their own, especially in our current contexts. So if there are goals that are looking to be, or that two individuals are hoping to accomplish in their own life, the presence of a teammate can be very ideal. But again, the idea of individual relationships being important or valued in any regard in this particular society would create further rabbit holes of individual perceptions of reality. So things wouldn't exist objectively anymore. Things would exist relative to the individuals within the relationship, and then relative to the individuals outside of that relationship. Because two individuals who enter into a relationship kind of create a quasi-living entity of their own. The relationship views the world in its own particular way, and when those two individuals are approaching life, they're approaching it with a collective or a singular, they're hopefully approaching it with a singular-minded approach to accomplish a specific goal that they have decided to accomplish together. Now, what this world state has done is essentially say that everyone is married to everyone. So we're all beholden to everyone. We are all physically exclusive with everyone. There's no reason for exclusivity between individuals, because exclusivity between individuals yields intimacy, and intimacy yields individuality. Individuality yields incongruent views of reality. And that is, to me, what it is that this society kind of is representing, is what it would take for a congruent view of reality to occur amongst a collective consciousness of individuals. And to further that point, Huxley mentions specific, restrictions that are placed on individuals in the way that they interact with the world. And these are pretty typical, very, very emblematic of dystopian novels. And I don't know exactly where in the timeline Huxley's this particular novel falls as far as things like that is concerned, or are concerned, rather. But I do think that it is important for us to mention the restrictions that are placed on individuals within this society. Now, something that I will say is unique in this particular iteration of a dystopian novel is that these restrictions are so well adopted by the individual participants of this particular society that they don't even believe them to be restrictions. They just simply are the way that people live. There is a specific mention made by the director who's been giving this tour, or by another person who's at this social gathering that we're getting to at the beginning of Chapter 4, who talks about how there are certain things that are placed in the world in order to prevent individuals from spending too much time thinking. And one of those things in particular is a reliance on the state, or a reliance on something greater than them. And now I don't necessarily think that Huxley is commenting exclusively on the ideas of communism that would have been pretty rampant in Europe at the time of his writing this, because, you know, especially in Germany post-World War I, the Communist Party is gathering a lot of power, and this is, I believe, if I remember correctly, published in the 1930s, which Hitler would have already been well on his way into power, and they would have started practicing a lot of appeasement in Britain, which is where Huxley is from, if I'm remembering correctly. If any of that is incorrect, someone please correct me in the comments so I don't sound like a fool. But regardless, I think that Huxley is not only commenting on the ideas of the state, but on the ideas of religion in this particular regard. It's kind of similar to what I had mentioned earlier, that if an objective reality exists because of a collective consciousness that is singularly minded, then things no longer, like thought no longer becomes a necessity, because we're not forced to analyze anything. We're just simply given things at face value, and that is the way that they are, because it's the way that they have been told to be, or told by others have told us by which to perceive those things. Sorry, stumbling over my words there. And if that's the way that the world is, then why would we bother thinking into it? So what's interesting about the particular restrictions in this universe is that they don't even need to be enforced, because it is people are so deeply entrenched in the objectivity of the world created by this collective consciousness that they don't have the need to pursue any kind of deeper meaning. And again, this harkens back to ideas of Nietzsche and his gripe with organized religion, and also Nietzsche's gripe with the idea of an organized state. It's ludicrous that Nietzsche was ever considered a supporter of the ideas of Hitler. Nietzsche spends a substantial amount of time just absolutely going on tirades about how stupid anti-Semitism is as a practice, and why it makes absolutely no sense that people would be uninclusive of people of other cultures, and like why I think Nietzsche is an embracer of the ideas of chaos as order, rather than the idea of order as order, or chaos as chaos. I think that part of what Huxley is kind of trying to get us to understand is that while the ideas of chaos being chaos and order being order are somewhat conducive to I don't want to say a layman's, but I guess just an easy interpretation of the world around us, a more complex and meaningful interpretation of the world around us might involve much more paradoxical thought processes, where order is a form of chaos because it is not the intended version of the universe in some capacity, and chaos is order in that it is the intended way of being, ideally for what is most prosperous for all individuals. But that just goes into whether or not you would weigh the overall prosperity of a group as being more paramount than the maximum prosperity of an individual, which I would think that Huxley would be an advocate for the maximum amount of prosperity for an individual. Hence why this novel is a dystopian novel, not a utopian novel. Hence why there's conflict in the characters with the way in which things are run, rather than this simply being a story of a society where these things occurred. Obviously, the fact that there is some contention with the way that things are happening in the world around them is evidence of the fact that Huxley doesn't support this idea as being an ideal world. Despite the fact that he's objectively portraying the world for us at the beginning of it, I know, and everybody knows ultimately for a fact, that this is going to be a dystopian novel. But I just think that it's important to point out the subtle ways in which Huxley is establishing that for us at the beginning of the novel, because it helps us to further interpret things that he does later on down the line as we continue to read this book, which I am very much looking forward to doing. So that about does it for this week. We covered a lot of ground, only went through 2 chapters. I have a feeling that this book is going to be kind of a long slog, the same way that Hyperion was a long slog, though we only went through like a chapter a week there, but that's because those chapters are like 100 pages long. But we'll see how things kind of progress in the coming weeks and what becomes like the ideal amount of substance to talk about or of plot to talk about. I am fairly confident that we're going to get through this book. I wouldn't say quickly necessarily, but relatively fast. I am a big fan of it so far. I hope that you guys will check it out. And again, if you've read it before, maybe think of this as a blind guy getting to read through the book for the first time, which is, pretty enjoyable in my opinion, especially since I'm the blind guy doing it. So I hope that all of you all have enjoyed this episode. If you did, make sure to give us a like, a follow. We're on Twitter. We are on Facebook, GSMC Podcasts. Check out some of our other shows. Leave us a 5-star review. We would love that. Post any thoughts that you have or corrections that you have for me in the comments. I would love to see them. And I hope everyone is staying safe out there. Happy Wednesday, I guess.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.